Awesome, Seth, thank you. I have a number of questions, some that came up even for me, some that we collected from registrants kind of leading in. So I'm just going to kind of dive in and start firing them off for you.
Great.
This is highly subjective, but I think it's valuable, especially given your experience consultatively. One of the questions I hear a lot from startups is around how to kind of structure my teams about growth and who should kind of own that. So, in a larger scale organization, we're more familiar with siloed departments. There's the sales team, there's the marketing team, there may even be a product marketing team, which is subset of marketing. At a startup, you're a little bit more flat. You're still very much in the learning phase. Who should be in charge of growth within that organization?
The safe answer I would give is it's organization dependent. I can only speak anecdotally. It is a highly subjective question. The person who is in charge of growth is the person who is able to touch and influence product and marketing and development and pricing. If they can't touch those 4 areas, they're not going to be an effective growth lead. And I realize that is a challenging ask for a lot of organizations because maybe marketing and product are quite siloed. They don't like working with each other, or engineering has a fixed set of sprints. And the way engineering and product work is very well defined, and pricing happens in corporate and it happens somewhere else. But I would argue that in order to do effective growth hacking, which is the notion of looking at your data, deriving insights from your data and acting on it, you have to be able to measure everything well, which means you have to work with the product team and the engineering team to put the measurements in place along the lines of what I was describing earlier with those page and track and identify calls. If you don't have good influence and the ability to oversee that work, you can't measure the data correctly. And in an ideal world, you get those same product people and engineers interested in the data, not just treating it like a chore, but treating it like a very helpful resource to determine adoption of a new feature or traction overall, looking at retention numbers and figuring out how well are we doing with our product. The more you can cultivate a meaningful, authentic interest in the data that you're forcing the people that you work with to spend their hours collecting and measuring on their website, I think the more aligned they will be with the work you're proposing. And furthermore, the more likely they are to codify the collection of that data into their process of development when they release new features. Because the biggest challenge I've found with growth teams is that we spend all this time doing measurement of the application itself. And then a couple cycles go by and everyone's happy. And then 25 new features come out over the next year, and none of them are measured because there was no codification of the measurement process as it related to product development. So that's on the product and engineering side. Then there's this whole notion of, fine, I've measured, how do I act? How do I change my messaging so I can take the insights from the data and turn it into some form of call to action? And, hopefully when you hear the word call to action, you think about the marketing team. And I would argue there are 2 different pieces to that team. There's the top of funnel customer acquisition, broad brand and product benefits marketing team. They're sort of a little more outbound. Maybe they're doing some sort of inbound work and they're teaching people about the value propositions of the products. Great. But they're trying to bring people into the funnel and they're trying to get people to share. Then you've got what I would call the product marketing team. So once you've acquired a new user, how do you activate and retain that user so they turn into a loyal user? And then if you're trying to generate money, which hopefully you are as a business, a paying user, right? How do you derive revenue from that individual as well? And then finally, and this is in either or in terms of order, how do you get them to refer other people to the platform? What's the viral coefficient associated with growth? So all the data in the world is terrible and useless unless you have someone who can make product messaging happen to drive activation and retention and referrals and revenue, and someone can also own all of the top of funnel growth and visibility of the product or service to then put more volume downwards into the rest of the funnel that is then optimized by that product marketing person. I would argue in terms of order of those two activities, and this might sound counterintuitive, you want to focus on product marketing before you focus on top of funnel growth. Because so if you're building out a team, you actually engage the traditional marketing team last. Because the last thing you want, because marketing teams typically want to go in with a splash and do tons of high volume stuff to say, we got volume in, right? But if you send a bunch of volume into a leaky funnel, and you get a bunch of leaky buckets from stage to stage, from like they're considering it to they signed up to they're retained to they're referring other people, well, then you've wasted all of the effort of putting a bunch of volume into the top of the funnel. So in my mind, therefore, and then finally, I'm sorry, the last piece of this, which is pricing that I mentioned before, you've got to work with pricing strategy, and you've got to somehow tie your marketing team and your product team together with whomever is setting pricing strategy to understand if that is a deal breaker later on. Because if you're running a freemium product, for instance, and you've done everything beautifully, but the value proposition of the pricing is wrong, then you've done all of this effort, and then you have this huge falling off point, and you need to have the ability as someone who's focused on growth to have that conversation and not have it be this sacred cow that you can't touch, but instead say, hey, I've measured it. It looks like whenever we try and convert free to paid users, conversions falling off a cliff. Let's talk about this and figure out who that decision maker is and make sure they're in the room. So hopefully, Suzanne, that answers your broader structural question. I would want those 4 stakeholders in the room. And then the order in which I'd want to bring them in is engineering and product first. I want engineering to measure. I want product to oversee the measurement sprints and codify the measurement moving forward. I want pricing involved next, because I'm going to look at the lowest point in the funnel to figure out, are we losing things there first, and then work up the funnel. So then pricing, then product marketing, then bring the rest of the marketing team into place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's powerful. You said a lot there, and the ones that really stick out for me are, again, having a clear plan going in. That's the initial architecture. And I want to talk to you in just a moment about your role as a solutions architect at Segment. But so having an initial architecture, but then exactly, product is being iterated on all the time. New ideas are coming forth. And, you know, when we're feature hogs, then we want to try and jam as many new things into a sprint cycle as possible. And rarely do we properly provision a sprint for an appropriate kind of allocation of not just new features, but of course, bug fixes, documentation. And I think inside of documentation is revisiting our analytics plan to say, are we accounting for new events then that we might want to track? And your suggestion here, it sounds like, is some of that ownership should live with the product manager or the product owner, who is going to be interfacing by necessity with those other business stakeholders in sales and marketing.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised the notion of an analytics plan or a tracking plan, because that's another very important piece of the process that I, as a solutions architect, engage with. And whenever I was doing an implementation of Segment, even before I joined Segment, that was core to the work I was doing. The notion is that you create a document that has in it is a single source of truth of every single event that you are tracking and every single way you are identifying users, every page call that you're doing. And it shows what properties are we capturing for each of those events, when are they fired off, and then what is the development status? Is it being tested? Has it been approved? Is it live? Is it being modified? The reason why one of those documents is so important is, first of all, it's a wonderful framing sort of piece of framework that says what matters to us. And by the way, we tie all of the stuff that we say we must track to a business goal or to some sort of KPI or measurable imperative for the business. Because I can't tell you how often I work with companies that say, we want to track every click. Every single click, we want to track it. Every button click, every modal. And I say, why? And they say, the UX team wants it. And I say, but why does the UX team want it? And they say, well, because they need to know what's being clicked and what's not. And I said, but let's talk about the funnels that you want to track. Let's talk about the flows that you want to put users through. If we can identify the right sequence of events that measures funnels, wouldn't that be easier for the UX team to understand? Because if they went from step 1 to step 2 in the funnel, and there were only 3 ways that they could get there, and we can capture those different ways and properties of the event, doesn't that help them answer their questions without saying button clicked 800 million times? And so there's that conversation, which is strategic measurement of events. The second related conversation on a tracking plan is prioritization. So I've listed 200 events that I've decided are mission critical for the business. Fine. As you've said, Suzanne, there's only so much you can do in 1 sprint, let alone 5 sprints. And we want to cram as much as we can into it. But let's be realistic. If I gave a development team 200 events to track in 1 sprint, they would do all 200 very poorly, and none of them would really measure what we want to get at. So I would so much rather see the first 5 or first 3 most important events measured well and establish baseline KPIs, and then have the next set of 5 to 10, and then the next set of 10 to 15. So that's another thing the tracking plan does. It helps you set priorities for what do I measure first, and what's most important. And then the final piece is it creates documentation for new team members, whether they are engineers, product managers, data analysts, or data scientists, to understand the schema of your event tracking world without having to ask 25 people 25 different times, what does this thing mean? Or without having to infer it from the data that's available inside of the data warehouse or inside of Google Analytics or inside of Mixpanel. So in an ideal world, your tracking plan is a living, breathing document that summarizes for new members of the team, here's the way our data flow works. And for the most important stakeholders, here's why we're measuring what when we're measuring.
So here's a question that I think is specific to Segment and its configuration. So let's imagine first a world where I didn't know about Segment and the values that it can offer to a team like mine. So I'm still kind of you back in the day. I'm like, hey, developer, I want to do this stuff in Google. Hey, developer, I also want to do this stuff in Mixpanel. So the context there is I, as the product manager or the person who's kind of owning the analytics plan, has a plan for Mixpanel and the events that I want to track for that, and a plan for Google and the events that I want to track for that. How does that use case change if I'm using Segment? Am I just creating a single plan based on Segment, and then Segment knows how to send the data to the other sources, and I can just run reports in those tools to carve it up into different views?
That's exactly right. So in the old way, you might be doing things. Now, first of all, you've made a wonderful assumption, which is you had a plan associated with tracking. You had a Mixpanel plan, and you get many cookies if that is the case. And I don't mean web cookies, because that's amazing. Usually it's ad hoc, right? Usually it's we've tracked this bunch of usually page views and 1 or 2 conversion events inside of Google Analytics, and we tracked a bunch of UI, UX things inside of Mixpanel. And there's maybe the Venn diagram is some small overlap around the conversion events, and that's it. And typically we weren't tracking page views in Mixpanel, we weren't doing events inside of Google Analytics, and our analytics team was happy using Mixpanel, our product team was using Mixpanel, and our marketing team was using Google Analytics. Fine, I guess. The way it would work in Segment is that you'd create one unified tracking plan, and you would track all of the page views and all of the events with Segment. And you do have the ability within Segment to specify whether or not you want certain destinations to receive certain events. So you could do it in the code, or you can do it with the interface, and you can selectively filter one event and only send it to Google Analytics, or only send it to Mixpanel, or only send it to 3 of the 5 destinations that you have set up. The benefit, though, is that Mixpanel can receive page views and can actually, so long as you're playing well within your event limits for Mixpanel, you can do some really interesting page view analysis with all of the Mixpanel page views inside of Mixpanel. Furthermore, the way Segment works is it writes into all of the events the page context. So UTM codes and anything that was in the header and the session information, all of that gets written into the event itself. So if I want to understand event conversions by UTM code, and like what sources or what mediums drove this certain set of events uniquely or in total. I can do that very easily in whatever platform I want. The big benefit, though, aside from any of that, is opening up the possibility for any number of teams within your organization to start experimenting with tools that could speed up their workflow and provide better value. So Google Analytics might be great, but what happens when you want to start experimenting with Google AdWords and send the same events that Google Analytics is receiving into AdWords? With Segment, it's the flip of a switch. And all of a sudden, the events start streaming into AdWords, and you can look at AdWords conversions. Similarly, if your team is sick of Mixpanel for whatever reason and they want to start playing with Amplitude, you don't have to reinvent the wheel and integrate Amplitude directly into your website. You just go to Segment, flip on Amplitude, add your API key, and magically all the data starts flowing. And if you have a high enough level plan, you can actually do something called replay, which means you can replay all of the historical data that Segment has into the new tool that you've just turned on, as if you started with that new tool on day one of collecting data with Segment. So it's it creates this mechanism for tool experimentation without any sort of accumulation of technical debt. And then it empowers your marketing team, your product team, your engineering team to do the most they can with the data infrastructure that your website has generated.
So I think you spoke to this exact point in your last comment, but I really want to make sure. And the question is around how much do I need to know about the tools that I'm going to use additionally to Segment going in? And what I perceive from your answer is you don't. You know, work with Segment, get a good analytics plan in place, and then start to bolt on other tools. So if I'm sitting between Heap or Mixpanel or Amplitude, and I don't really know, doesn't matter, get that Segment implementation handled and trust that you can flow it correctly at a later point, at any point.
Yeah, exactly. So long as you're measuring data around best practices, which means you're using the page call for what it's meant to be, understanding where a user is on your website. Same with a screen call. You're using the track call for what it's meant to be, which is you understand what your user is doing on any one of those pages. It's very good for single page apps. And you're using the identify call for what it's meant for, which is to identify who is doing that action. So long as you're abiding by those basic principles, and you, within page and track, you're doing a good job of minimizing the number of events and maximizing the number of properties inside of each of those events, because that enables easy pivoting on the data. You've basically set yourself up for success to flip on any number of tools down the road. And
Right.
you don't, so I would qualify what you said, Suzanne, very slightly, which is you don't need to know which tools you're going to use, but you do need to understand the use case for your data. So you do need to understand that if there's a chance you're going to want to target your marketing around certain actions that users are taking. I don't know how I'm going to target the marketing. I don't know if it's going to be MailChimp or Customer.io or Intercom, but I know I want to down the road behaviorally target my customers based on certain actions they've taken. Then you need to measure that data using something like Segment.
Yeah. That's a great quote. I don't know, I foreshadow that it's going to end up somehow in the clickable version of this webinar when we share it out with some of the folks beyond our network. Two last questions for you, because I know that we're coming toward the end of our time. Sure. Is there a best practice for creating a tagging plan itself? You know, and this is like a hyper tactical type of inquiry, but I find sometimes it's the hyper tactical stuff we long for and gets skipped over. How do I build a tagging? Like, what does it look like? What tools should I use to put that in? Will you do it for me?
Segment does build tracking plans for its business tier customers. We also make tracking plan templates available. Everything we do is in Google Sheets. I've built a lot of tracking plans in my day, and I found that Google Sheets tends to be the most reliable in terms of just flexibility. I can sneak preview something right now.
Yeah. Don't do anything that's going to get you in trouble, but definitely give us some good stuff if you can.
So this is a sneak peek at what we are we're going to release some version of this for the public. And this is what we use for our customers as well. But we're basically identifying some especially we're identifying business goals. So we want to basically say, okay, what are the major goals that we want to achieve with this tracking? We want to activate new signups, and here are the metrics we want to achieve, and this is what activating new signups looks like, and add some detail, and then talk about the different sources and destinations we're going to use. Then we want to reduce our cart abandonment, and here's how we're going to do it. And these are the different, we're going to use MailChimp with data from web and mobile to email cart abandoners 1 hour after the item was added, right? So this takes it from highly abstract but very measurable to highly tactical and tangible in one place. From there, we define what does our data flow look like, and this is meant to mimic the segment interface itself and how it shows flows from sources, whether web or database, iOS, Android, through schemas like different tables that are generated in your data warehouse to destinations like Redshift or Braze. And then here's the status of each of those sources and whether or not they're going to accept those destinations. And then nuances, right? So, hey, like Braze typically counts each trait sent in on each identify call against a monthly user limit. So you've got to be very careful about how you send in those traits, right? From there, we've created, this is a new thing that I've built that I'm very, very excited about. Segment has a wonderful semantic event infrastructure already in place. So if you basically go to Segment spec and you look up, its e-commerce events, it has a set of optimal events for browsing products and looking at promotions and ordering, right? And so what we've done is, hold on one sec, let me just make sure. Uh-oh. Sorry, give me one sec.
We're like dangling off the edge of our seats here. While you're pulling it up, I mean, I love that spreadsheet, by the way. It's like, probably inappropriate how it makes me feel, inside. But I'm sure somebody who's watching in or listening in could potentially feel overwhelmed. Like there's a level of sophistication in this plan. So one question would be, should I expect to have a plan this tight day one? What does it take?
Let me walk you through this flow, and then you'll understand sort of how it's actually not super overwhelming, but also where the sort of P1 version of this is, the minimum viable. So these are all of the recommended events that we have, and all you do in this part of the plan is you say, yes, this is relevant to me, or no, this is not relevant to me, and that's it. So you can get a sense of the kinds of things you want to track, and then put any custom things down below. You talk about the very basic pages that you want to track, and frankly, those pages are typically just generic. You don't need to even call them out. You talk about the user traits that you want to track. So these are the different, whether it's the properties that are universal across all events, and then when the user traits get identified. And then finally, we get to the event tracking itself. And really what we're talking about here, and this is where things get beautiful. It used to be that you had to populate all of this by hand to build your own tracking plan. And what we are hopefully going to release sooner than later to the public is a version of this that has all of the properties pre-populated for you. So it's simply a matter of saying, yes, this event is relevant, and boom, it's now in your tracking plan. Wow. So we're trying to take the heavy lifting out of building these plans so you can create something that's very complicated very quickly. It's incredible. It's also meant to be very streamlined. So you go through here and you simply say, oh, okay, so account created and signed up and signed in. These are all my P1 events. And so is, I don't know, product searched and checkout completed, right? Order completed. And then I can basically select the entire thing and filter it. And what I'm able to do ultimately is control the scope of my implementation. So here's my filter, whatever, I can't do it, and it'll basically filter on my P1s, right? So that's really what we're going for here, and that's what a good tracking plan looks like. It's one that And just to give you a little bit more of an understanding here, it defines the name of an event, when it happens, what the business goal is that's associated with the event, right? Because you got to tie it back to your business logic, what your priority is, where it's being captured, and the methods you're using. And then here's a code sample, just in case you want to see what the code was. And then this next piece is really where the rubber hits the road. So was it installed on your website? Was it tested on your website? What were your testing notes? Is it ready for deployment? Is it live? When was it first published? So this is basically like your progress tracker. And you should be able to look across this with your dev team and say, cool, all of our P1 events, they are now installed, but none of them are tested, or they're all tested and they're all live. And then this enables anyone who's new to the organization to come in here and to scroll through and use this as a reference.
Amazing. So we're at the end of our time here. You put your contact information up. I'm going to be doing a little follow-up article on everything that I've certainly learned here on this call from you. And we'll be sure to pass that contact information through. I guess the question is, if we're interested and we want to use Segment, how do we get somebody like you to help us? Or what kind of class of pricing do we have to fall into to get a beautiful tagging plan and all the hand holding we need?
So the class of pricing for really getting deep hand holding is into the 5 figures per year. But I've set up, so there are a couple of different ways you could do it. We work with solution partners who are outside of Segment. So like me in my former life would have been a solution partner. And I was running a consultancy that helps write tracking plans. And so ostensibly, if you needed help, but you didn't fall into the customer tier of spending lots of money out the gate, you can set up a free or a self-service plan on Segment, and you can reach out to our partnerships team. You can reach out to me, and I'll direct you to our partnerships team, and you can get a recommendation of an agency to work with who can help you write one of these tracking plans.
Right. Awesome.
Alternatively, if you end up spending lots of cash, I'm here to help you. And
all right.
And for your reference, and Suzanne, I'll send you this link as well, but slides.com/fam1 has a bunch of my different presentations, and the one that we went through today is the one on top.
Awesome. Seth Vermillion, you are the best. Can't wait to hang out with you again in person. Thank you for being part of this program and sharing all of your wisdom. I'm sure there's going to be lots of follow-up questions, and let us know when your course is ready, because we know tons of folks in our audience who will be hungry for all that content.
We'll absolutely do. Suzanne, thank you so much for having me on this webinar. It was really a pleasure, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with everyone.
All right. Bye for now, folks.
Bye. Thanks.